Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Late in the 19th century, the heroic age of Antarctic exploration began. The stories are full of bravery, tragedy and triumph over the extreme elements. Sir Douglas Mawson was one of these explorers who opened Antarctica up to Australians and contributed to Australia's claims to much of the Antarctic territory. Joining me today to discuss Sir Douglas Mawson is his great-granddaughter, Dr Emma McEwin. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Emma.
Thank you, Georgina.
What a legacy to have in your family, the legacy of Douglas Mawson. I remember as a child learning about him and Shackleton and Scott. So, these were great heroes of the age, and seems like a time very long ago now. Whether we have such explorers in our midst, I'm not so sure. But can you paint a picture? Your great-grandfather, Douglas Mawson, who was he?
Well, as you said, he was an Antarctic explorer and he went to the Antarctic 3 times, but he's most famous for the Australasian Antarctic expedition, which occurred between 1911 and 1914, which is often referred to as the AAE. And it was the first expedition outside of the country for Australia. And at the time, as you mentioned, Scott and Shackleton and other explorers were all going off on expeditions around the same years, really. And in fact, Mawson's first expedition was with Shackleton. So he kind of served his apprenticeship with Shackleton. And on that expedition, he got interested in going back and exploring an area that they didn't have time to explore at the time. So yes, just put it very briefly, the AAE was a big enterprise with 3 parties of men. One party went to Macquarie Island, which is a sub-Antarctic island, sort of halfway between Hobart and the Antarctic continent. And there were 2 parties that were on the continent. And he pioneered radio communication from the Antarctic during that expedition. So Macquarie Island was set up as a bit of a relay station between Melbourne and the Antarctic. And that didn't get going for a while, but it did eventually. And in fact, a lot of that data now is very important towards measuring climate change that they collected and about the weather over a sort of almost 2-year continuous period. But Mawson himself went on a sledging journey with 2 other men, and they both died on the journey, and Mawson came back the sole survivor. So that's really the story that most people know. And he was compelled to eat his husky dogs to survive. And so it's a real survival story that has been retold in various ways since.
Yeah, I mean, these explorers of the 19th, 20th century, early 20th century are huge figures in our history when you even think about the exploration of the Australian continent, Burke and Wills and, what happened and the sort of mystery. And, of course, your great-grandfather at least returned, but the heroism and the fact that they were prepared to go to completely undiscovered lands without the telecommunication and equipment that we have in this day and age. I mean, really cut off from the world. If things go wrong, there is absolutely no help. So, the bravery must have been enormous.
Yeah, I think, as you said, the equipment was pretty crude and the conditions, were very difficult. And so, I think that's something that fascinates people, that the hardships that they endured. I think that's one attraction to Antarctic exploration. And there have been a number of reenactments. Tim Jarvis, the Englishman who's based in Adelaide, he did a reenactment of Mawson's journey, and he's also done the Shackleton endurance reenactment as well. But he said that he had to wear the same clothes and eat equivalent rations. He couldn't eat dog, of course, but he said, the clothes were not warm at all and the food was terrible. so yeah.
Yeah. But presumably he had some satellite navigational equipment.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, not just the moon and the stars.
No. Well, he did actually still use the same equipment to is it a sextant, that you use to try to find your way? So I don't think it was easy. And there was no keel in the boat that he used on the Shackleton reenactment. So that was pretty hard.
Wow. You've written about the many lives of Douglas Mawson, and that's really interesting because, of course, we know him as the explorer, but what else was he? I mean, he was quite a polymath and, someone who had a really, really fascinating life beyond just this really important series of expeditions.
Yeah, as you said, with the title, The Many Lives of Douglas Mawson, my aim was to open up those different aspects of Mawson that have tended to get a bit lost because of his Antarctic experiences and achievements. But in terms of his lifetime, he spent only probably around 4 years in total in the Antarctic and, about 50 years at the University of Adelaide, firstly as a lecturer and then as professor of geology. And so he really was an academic most of the time when he wasn't travelling around, and wrote a lot of papers, and only a small fraction of those papers are on the Antarctic compared to other subjects. He had a lot of interests. He was interested in forestry. He started a company, South Australian Hardwoods, in the Adelaide Hills with neighbours, and it was a private company that they ran. They started by felling red gums, which they then sold the timber to BHP for mine shafts, and they sold timber for railway sleepers to the government. And then he expanded that and bought a couple of other properties in the hills and planted trees. He loved trees. He was a great advocate for planting trees. He was also a conservationist, which some people might find hard to believe, but he witnessed the sort of indiscriminate slaughtering of seals and penguins on Macquarie Island on the AE, and then he became instrumental in lobbying to make Macquarie Island a wildlife sanctuary, which it did become in 1933. And he was also a great advocate for controlled whaling because he was concerned that it's very hard in the Antarctic to police the killing of animals. And he was very concerned that if we depleted all the, populations of animals, then there wouldn't be anything left for future generations. He was very conscious of that. I think he wasn't really particularly fun-loving. I don't think he really ever did anything much for fun. I think it was always, even family holidays involved sort of dredging for specimens in a river or, that was his idea of fun. He was basically, I think, a workaholic really, and always curious, always inquiring, and just had a lot of interests.
I was interested that you note he had a strong constitution, a high pain threshold, and an astonishing resistance to the cold. So he was well primed for Antarctic exploration. But then you say he was uninterested in sport. And I thought for someone who must have gone through the most monumentally challenging physical exertions to be uninterested in sport, maybe it was just the competitive nature.
Well, I think it was, I think he saw it as, aimless in the way that, any physical work that he did had a goal. So I think that ties in with his just recreation was not really his thing, and sport kind of, fitted into that. Yeah.
And a poor sailor, apparently. So getting to Antarctica would have been a bit grim for him, maybe.
Yeah. One of the men on Shackleton's expedition, when he went on Shackleton's first expedition that Mawson went on as physicist in 1907 to 1909, he was very sick on the ship down to the Antarctic, and one of the men described him as weak and gutless. But then he noted that he worked hard once they were on the land. but yeah, that's how he became friendly with Captain Davis, who became the captain of his ship Aurora on the AE, and then later on Banzari on the first cruise, because Davis found him lying in a lifeboat looking very seedy. And so they struck up a friendship. Yeah.
He studies mining engineering at the University of Sydney, which led him to becoming a geologist, but how does he develop an interest in Antarctica from then? Is it the sort of scientific potential?
Well, he did a degree in mining engineering, as you said, and then also in geology. So he had 2 degrees. And then his mentor and lecturer at the University of Sydney, Edgeworth David, he was interested in glaciation and got him interested in evidences of glaciation. And so that's why he was interested in taking up a position in South Australia, which has some of the oldest evidences of glaciation in the Flinders Ranges and around Hallett Cove, Glacier Rock around there. And then when the opportunity arose when he found out that Shackleton was going down to the Antarctic in 1907, he met him in Adelaide and he said that he'd go, or he offered to go with him down to the Antarctic. If he'd take him on his ship, he'd offer his services for free just for the ride down there, because as he said, he wanted to see an ice age in being. And then that led to Shackleton offering him a position for the duration of the expedition. And then he was interested in an area called Dry Valley, which has got a lot of glaciation in the Antarctic, but he was tasked with going to the South Magnetic Pole on Shackleton's expedition. And so that would have been a side route and they didn't have time to explore it. And so then he wanted to go back and explore the science of the continent a lot more, find out more about the interior, which was still very unknown at the time.
Yeah, what was the difference in ambition between Mawson and Shackleton?
Well, Shackleton, like Scott, was interested in reaching the South Pole, and Mawson wasn't interested in that at all, partly because he wasn't interested in going over ground that had already been covered. He felt that it was important to just get a superficial idea of the interior of the continent by trying to expand exploration of all the areas that had not been found out, because no one had really mapped the interior. And Scott actually asked him to go with him on his expedition to the South Pole and promised him a position in the Pole Party. And this was obviously after he'd been with Shackleton's, and Shackleton had clearly been impressed with Mawson because he nominated him as the leader of a search party should he not return on time from his expedition. So on the British Antarctic expedition, Shackleton's first expedition, he tried to get to the South Pole on that expedition that Mawson was on. Mawson went to the South Magnetic Pole and Shackleton went to the South Geographic Pole, but didn't quite make it. But yeah, he nominated Mawson to lead a search party should he not return. So I think, he was pretty young. He was only 23 or so at the time. So that was a lot of responsibility to put on someone so young. And yeah, Scott invited him to go with him, but he wasn't interested in going to the pole. He had his own plans.
Yeah, so that scientific endeavour was a real driving force for him, wasn't it? His teams had more scientists in them than anything prior. So that really was marking, wasn't it, a shift in approach to Antarctica as a place of significant scientific research and exploration, scientific exploration rather than geographic exploration only.
Yes, I think that, they definitely go hand in hand. You can't really go to the Antarctic. You couldn't at that time without doing some geographic discovery. That was all part of it. But yes, I think, he was a scientist, whereas Scott and Shackleton had sort of naval backgrounds. And so, yeah, they had very different interests. And science was always an arm of all of those expeditions anyway. But yes, I think science was the driving motive for Mawson.
You've obviously researched the period extensively. How are these figures portrayed in the newspapers and reporting? Was this sort of something on the front page of the newspapers that captivated the nation day to day? Absolutely,
yeah. Now I think you'd be following it online every day. But yeah, I think obviously it was difficult and without much communication from the Antarctic. So it was sort of when ships went down to pick up men or drop things off, they'd bring back news. And so there's lots of delays in getting the news. But when it did come, yeah, it was absolutely something that everybody was reading and it was all over the papers.
Was there much comparison between the explorers, or it wasn't sort of considered too competitive?
It was extremely competitive, yeah. And I think because, well, we had Amundsen, Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian, who made it to the South Pole, and Scott, who made it but died on return from the pole in the same year. And then there was Shackleton, who was aiming to get there just before that. So, and prior to that, Scott had tried to reach it too. So there'd been many attempts. It was described as the race to the pole. So it was a race. It was seen as a race. So it's like a sporting event almost, really. So it was very competitive, and very competitive with nations as well, you know. And Mawson sort of tried to make his expedition, or distinguish it from Scott and Shackleton, by arguing that it was a scientific expedition and by arguing that it was an Australian expedition as well, and comprised of mostly Australians, and as you say, who were sort of university graduates, mostly in science. So
it's interesting, Emma, it's just after Federation, so Australia is such a young nation then, and you know, that sense of national identity as opposed to your, you know, South Australian colonial identity or New South Wales identity as he originally had. I would have thought his expedition and that sort of sense of nascent nationalism must have been really interesting to uncover.
Yes, that was certainly a big part of it, just to try to demonstrate that Australian men could withstand those conditions as well as Englishmen and as other, you know, other nations who were from colder countries. And interestingly, it's another desert and requires similar kinds of attributes, really, in terms of, you know, you're isolated. Obviously, it's cold, but I think they did stand up to those conditions and prove themselves. But yes, it was certainly important in shaping a national identity and getting Australia on the map, really.
So, of course, I mean, you've alluded to the Australian expedition that, of course, you know, really made Mawson incredibly famous and was marked with tragedy. Can you describe that expedition and what happened to his colleagues?
Well, very briefly, he was at one of the bases on the Antarctic continent, and there were 18 men in the hut. And in the summer of 1912, these 18 men set off in 6 parties of 3 men in different directions from the hut, the aim being to try to cover as much ground as they could. And Mawson's team consisted of him as the leader and Xavier Mertz, who was a Swiss mountaineer and skier or champion skier, and Lieutenant Belgrave Ninnis from England. And they were the only party to take dogs, partly because they were going the furthest, and it was called the Far Eastern Sledging Journey because they were going east. And during that journey, when they were just over 300 miles from the main base, from the hut that they'd built on arrival the year before, Ninnis fell down a crevasse with one of the sledges, taking half the dogs. So there were 12 dogs at the time, and 6 of them went down with him, and they were the 6 strongest. All the man food, human food, apart from 1 week's food, and all the dog food, the tent poles, and, you know, various other important pieces of equipment. And they called for hours, but he was too far down, and so they couldn't retrieve him. And so they were immediately in trouble, they realised, and they had to head back immediately. So they didn't get as far east as they wanted. They had another day or 2 to go. So they had to start killing the dogs on their return journey. And about 100 kilometres from the hut, or miles, should I say, I think, Xavier Mertz died. And there's been much speculation that this was from vitamin A poisoning from eating the livers of the husky dogs. apparently the Inuit are aware of this, and they don't eat the livers of any Arctic animals because of the high content of vitamin A, which can be lethal for humans. But without a body or anything, there's no way of knowing that. I mean, he'd lost his waterproof pants, and he was probably, I'm sure, grieving because he was very close to Ninnis, and he'd been in charge of the dogs as well, so he would have formed a relationship with them. Anyway, so Mawson was left on his own, 100 miles from the hut, and he had to cut his sledge in half with his pocket saw because it was too heavy to pull by himself. And that half sledge is now in the South Australian Museum. And he had a bit of food left, and the dog food, as in dog meat. And he had a pretty terrible journey back. The soles of his feet kind of came away, and he had to sort of bandage them back on together. And he crawled for a few miles because he was in such pain, but he had to keep going. And he fell down a crevasse at one point, the full length of the rope, and miraculously his sledge held at the edge of the crevasse, and he pulled himself up and then slipped back again. And he knew he had to think quickly because his fingers would freeze very quickly and he wouldn't be able to do anything. And he remembered at that time thinking how easy it would be to just cut the rope and just pass into oblivion. But he thought, oh, look, I've rationed all this food and it's sitting up the top there. and he thought of all the people who were supporting the expedition. He thought of Paquita, who he was engaged to and who was waiting for him. And he didn't want to disappoint them. So he managed to pull himself up, but he passed out. He says he couldn't remember even managing to do that. And then he got to a cave that they'd excavated in the ice the year before, and he found some food in there, a pineapple and some other food, and he knew the ship had arrived. But then a blizzard came for a couple of days and he couldn't get back to the hut. He was only 5 miles from there. But when he finally did come out of the cave, the ship had sailed only a few hours before that. They'd waited for more than a week for him. But because the ice freezes over and they had to go and pick up the other party further along the coast, they had to leave. So he was then doomed to spend another winter in the Antarctic with 6 men who stayed behind to look after him.
That is just an incredible story. You can't imagine the resilience of the man to have just overcome losing 2 colleagues and then, of course, having to eat his dogs, falling down a crevasse and getting back up, falling down again. I mean, just the setbacks, and then seeing the rescue vessel just in the distance must have just been devastating. How do you think he managed it? I mean, you're receiving these stories from your relatives, from your grandmother, and
well, I think he was just very good at compartmentalizing his feelings. You know, I think it was a survival thing, and I don't think he was one to look back. I think he looked forward. I think that he didn't dwell on things, I don't think, and didn't allow himself to do that. He was also quite wiry and lean, and I think that probably physically he had a strong constitution. He must have, because he was suffering from these terrible stomach pains and things, so he was obviously being poisoned by this excess of vitamin A in the dog livers as well. I don't think that was doing him any good. I think also his prior experience with Shackleton would have helped. And I mean, he said later that, or in a letter to Paquita that he wrote from the hut, that she was always there in his mind, but, you know, necessarily he couldn't have her in the forefront of his mind. He said something along those lines. I think he was very practical and, mentally hardy. Whereas I think that Mertz was a much more emotional kind of person.
There were some pretty unpleasant rumours after his return. He's obviously the only survivor of 3, and he can say, well, Ninnis fell down a crevasse. But the nature of Mertz's death is contested, and there are rumours that Mawson actually ate him. I mean, obviously as a family that's very, very difficult to face those rumours. And in the end, there's no body, no one will ever know.
And only his
account remained. What do you think, Emma, having looked into this and, of course, read various accounts, including his own?
Well, I don't think at the time anyone thought that. I don't think there were any rumours or any thoughts that was, well, they certainly weren't voiced, that he cannibalised Mertz. But I don't know, to me there isn't any shame in doing that if that, was a way of surviving. But I think that with the death of Mertz, he probably had a little bit more food for him, obviously. And, he does say in his diary that he sort of weighed it up, but he didn't really know what Mertz had died of. He'd had all these fits and diarrhea, and he was having to clean him in his bag, and he was ranting and raving. And so, with not knowing what he died of, it probably wouldn't have been a very good decision to make anyway. And I think ultimately he probably had enough food, but I don't think it's something that Mawson would not do. I think because he was practical, I think it's completely in keeping with him. If that was the only option, I think he would have done that, but I don't think he needed to.
His fiancée, Paquita, was, as you say, it was always in his mind, and while not at the forefront, it was at least there and motivating him. There are lovely letters between the two of them. They wouldn't have been very frequent, I can't imagine. But your first book you wrote about this love story, didn't you? Yes, I did, which I was inspired by those letters because I wanted to consider Paquita's role in his survival. And so my title, An Antarctic Affair, really refers to his affair with the continent and his affair with her. She saw the Antarctic as her rival, really, I think. Yeah, these letters are pretty interesting. They were discovered in his paper estate when Nancy Robinson Flannery, who edited the letters, was valuing his paper estate, and she came across the letters from Paquita to Mawson, and she wondered where his letters to her were. And it wasn't until my great-aunt Pat died. So the Mawsons had two daughters, Pat and my grandmother, Jessica. And Pat had the letters, but she would, when Nancy would visit, she'd say, look, feel free to look through this cupboard for any letters. And she'd open the cupboard and all these papers would fly out, and she just didn't feel she could do that. So it wasn't until my great-aunt's death that she got those letters. Pat's sons found them and put them together, and she believed that they were a complete set. So they continued to write to each other even though they didn't receive these letters at the time. So they had to give a lot of the letters to each other at the end of the expedition. But I think this is another distinguishing factor about Mawson's expedition compared to Scott and Shackleton's and Amundsen's. Obviously, Scott was married and his wife, Kathleen, was very supportive, and Shackleton's wife, Emily. But this was sort of an unusual situation in that Paquita had to wait more than 2 years, and their engagement was really just a series of letters that were mostly undelivered. Yeah.
But I think that I'm sure that was a great comfort to him. And I think that that was probably also another factor in his survival, in that, if he hadn't had Paquita, hadn't met her, didn't have any plans, any woman in his life, I think, he might not have been quite so driven.
Tell me about their wedding. So it was a bit of an Antarctic-themed wedding, wasn't it? When they finally got to get married. Yeah.
Yes, it was Antarctic-themed. They married about a month after he got back from the Antarctic in early 1914. And, I think it sort of set the tone for their marriage because, the wedding cake sort of had huskies and all sorts of other things on it. Everyone had a little penguin at their place at the table. And then they went to England immediately, like the next day, and that was all, Antarctic related in terms of just trying to give talks and work on the story of the expedition for publication. And so Paquita was sort of sidelined again, I think, really during that time.
They visited, didn't they, the families of Ninnis and Mertz? That must have been terribly sad for them and no doubt for the families too.
Yeah, I mean, they don't say a lot about that. There's not a lot of information, but apparently Belgrave, Ninnis's mother and sister, they met in London. They were very upset, but I don't think there was any blame or anything there. And I think the Mertz family were less consolable just because there may have been a sense, Mertz had gone on this expedition, but it wasn't even, a Swiss expedition, it was Australian, and he wasn't a scientist. It might have seemed to them a bit of a futile expedition, but I don't really know.
Did people like Paquita, who were those left at home, I guess invariably the wives or fiancés, did they see the bigger picture, though, that these explorers were doing something for their nation, for science, for the world?
Oh, completely. And I think what's interesting to me is that, you can see the attraction perhaps for a woman to want to marry an explorer, but I think there was just as much thought on the men's side in terms of choosing a wife who would be able to enable their career and even promote it. And I think that's the case in so many of these partnerships between explorers and their wives. Paquita is no exception to this. She was Mawson's first biographer. And when she went travelling, she'd meet scientists on his behalf, and she maintained friendships with a lot of the men on his expeditions, and she was very supportive. And she says in her biography of him that she wasn't very keen on the idea of him going off to the Antarctic, and her father even less keen. But she said once she realised that he determined to go, she said he had no keener supporter. And so I think she said that for him, science came first every time, before her and before the family, and she understood that.
Yeah, well, she must have. It's interesting you write about how penguins are everywhere in her house, throughout her life, until her death. On her shower curtain. And
this is my grandmother, actually. This is Jessica, the younger daughter of the Mawsons.
So so the penguin is a sort of a family icon, is it?
Well, yeah, these things just, are always floating around. And, yeah, I think probably people gave her things with penguins on them too and things, Yeah.
It's interesting. My grandmother travelled many times in her later years of her life to Antarctica as a tourist, not an explorer or adventurer. Mm-hmm. And she called all her friends she collected during those trips penguins. So,
mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about Mawson's life after his Antarctic exploration come to an end? Because it's interesting you're saying his university academic career actually ends up not being much about Antarctica.
Well, I mean, it was in terms of it was always connected because of his interest in evidences of glaciation in the Flinders, and so there's always that connection. But I don't think his connection to the Antarctic ever finished. Even later on he was involved in ANARI. I don't know if you've heard about that, which is the Australian Antarctic Research Expedition, which was established in 1947, I think, and Mawson was appointed. It was basically the aim of that was to establish permanent stations in the Antarctic, and now Australia has 3 permanent stations, and the first one, called Mawson, was established in 1954 during Mawson's lifetime. And he was too old to be travelling himself at that point, but it was sort of inspired by the discoveries and work that he'd done on his last trip to the Antarctic, when he went on what was called the British Antarctic New Zealand Research Expeditions, Australian New Zealand Research Expeditions, which was referred to as Banzari. And these were 2 cruises over the summers of 1929 to 30 and 1930 to 31. And they were mostly oceanographic cruises, so there wasn't the same, they did do some landings, but there wasn't any sledging into the interior or anything at this point. And a lot of that was consolidating the land claims that they'd made and discovered on the AAE in 1911 to 14. And that's when, he claimed this territory for Australia. And as we say now, that due to this, we now claim 42% of the continent. And so, Anari was set up, and that led to the permanent stations that we have now, which are devoted to science and exploration. And so he didn't ever stop that. And he was still writing up reports. The scientific reports were still not finished of Bansari when he died in 1958, and they finished in 1931, and they weren't finished then. So it was a lifetime commitment. But he had 3 properties in the Adelaide Hills, and he loved going there and doing the planting trees, and had a working farm. And so, he did have other interests.
Paquita and Robert Menzies had a friendship or a relationship, which is really interesting. Of course, very interesting to us here at the Robert Menzies Institute. Can you talk about that and how they met? And of course, even the state funeral that Menzies gives Douglas Mawson when he dies in 1958.
Well, I think it started with Paquita, as I mentioned, wrote Mawson's biography, which was published in 1964, several years after his death. But she also, before that, wrote a biography of her father, Guillaume Daniel Delprat, who was known as GDD, and he was the director of BHP for about 21 years or so, and instrumental in the establishment of the Newcastle Steelworks. So she wrote a biography of him called A Vision of Steel, and Menzies wrote the foreword to that. And then that's where their friendship started. So that was published in the year of Mawson's death. He was still alive when it was launched. And then she continued to have a connection with him. Apparently she called him Bobby, according to my father, so it was very, very casual. So later on, he opened the Mawson Institute for Antarctic Research at the University of Adelaide, which was really the prequel to the South Australian Museum Antarctic or Polar Collection now. And that opened in 1959, and officially in 1961, and Menzies opened that in Adelaide. And then later on, I think he'd had a stroke, and she wrote to him in hospital and advised him to find a nurse to dance with to get his muscles working again. And he said that he didn't like dancing at all and found it amusing to think of himself dancing with a nurse. But she said this because her younger daughter, Jessica, had an accident, a shooting accident, when she was 14. Mawson let his daughters learn to shoot, or he had a gun and they used to shoot at a target. But they had to do this under his supervision. And one day, Jessica didn't get his permission, and she had a friend and thought she could advise the friend on how to target shoot. And recalling this story, she said, I obviously wasn't doing a very good job, because the next minute her friend had shot her in the leg. And she was in hospital for 6 months, and they thought she might never walk again. And Paquita used to put the gramophone on and dance a waltzer up and down the living room. And so that's why she said that had worked for Jessica, and so she thought that might work for him.
Might have helped Sir Robert or Bobby.
Yeah.
She knew him by. Yeah. Oh, Emma, it's been delightful to hear about your great-grandfather and, of course, your great-grandmother too. It's always important to hear the story of the women who support these men, as often it is a lesser-known story, but just as important. So I thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.